Okay, cool. Well, welcome everyone who is here and has been waiting. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here today. My name is Ash. I'm a member of the Firestorm Collective, and I'm really looking forward to hosting today's conversation between writer Peter Gelderloos and mining justice organizer Sarah Wochele as they discuss Peter's latest work. The solutions are already here, strategies of ecological revolution from below. Before we start, if this is your first time joining an event with us, Firestorm Books is a 14-year-old worker-owned cooperative and radical bookstore in so-called Asheville, North Carolina, on occupied lands of Cherokee people. We're an anarchist collective that specializes in titles related to feminism, queerness, social movements, and radical politics. We're also a community event space. However, due to the ongoing pandemic, we continue to hold our community and author events entirely online. With that said, we do have a list of exciting virtual events coming up. In fact, this Thursday, November 3rd, we'll host writer and organizer Shane Burley in conversation with contributors to the new collection from AK Press, No Pasaran, Anti-Fascist Dispatches from a World in Crisis. So if you're interested in signing up for that or any other event happening through Firestorm, you can follow us on social media, and I will drop a link to our community calendar in the chat. And for those of you who are in the live audience today, our speakers are excited to field your questions. So if you're interested in asking anything at any point, I'll just encourage you to submit questions throughout the discussion using the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen if you're attending on Zoom, or in the comments if you're following along on the live stream. Well, cool. Moving on to today's event then. Across the world, grassroots networks of local communities are working to realize their visions of an alternative revolutionary response to planetary destruction, often pitted against the greenwashed alternative energy infrastructures and neocolonialist technocratic policies that are the forerunners of the Green New Deal. Through interviews with food sovereignty activists, indigenous communities reforesting their lands, and anarchists fighting biofuel plantations in Indonesia, Gelderloos looks at the battles that have canceled airports, stopped pipelines, and helped the most marginalized fight borders and environmental racism, transform cities, and win a dignified survival. Peter Gelderloos is a writer and movement participant. He is the author of How Nonviolence Protects the State, Anarchy Works, and Worshipping Power, an anarchist view of early state formation, all of which you can pick up at Firestorm. And Sarah Wochele is a mining justice organizer and researcher committed to eco-social liberation. So Peter, Sarah, thanks so much for taking time on this Sunday afternoon to share your thoughts and your work and your insights with us. And I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
Thanks so much, Ash. We really appreciate it. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm going to kick us off and introduce myself more before we get into conversation with Peter. The way that we had planned for things to go today would be Peter's going to kind of go over the basic themes of each of the chapters, but we also wanted to ensure that folks could interact with us and ask questions along the way. So please feel free to ask questions. We want to kind of guide this in the direction that y'all want to go. So again, my name is Sarah Wochele. I use she pronouns. I'm a mining justice organizer on Southern Paiute Territory, which is Las Vegas, Nevada. I work primarily with communities across the country who are, well, not fully across the country, specifically in Nevada, but also across the country, that are on the front lines of mining extraction projects. And so, like I said, I also have connections to other communities across the country who are fighting mining. So you may have heard of Thacker Pass or Bihimaha, and this is an Indigenous-led movement to protect Bihimaha from a proposed lithium mine up in northern Nevada along the so-called border with Oregon. And this includes Paiute and Shoshone people, specifically people of Red Mountain. There's also communities around the country that you might not know about who are fighting mining projects. And so I'm just going to kind of drop a couple of them so folks know. So this includes the No Ambler Road Coalition. The Ambler Road is like a proposed 211 mile long road in Alaska. Lots of Indigenous groups and other allied supporters are working to fight this road. It's a mining road, so they're trying to basically create kind of like a mining complex in which this road would help get that happening. There's also multiple fights in Arizona, specifically against copper mines. So this includes proposed mining at Oak Flat and then the east and west sides of the Santa Rita Mountains. You may have heard of the Rosemont copper fight. And also now there's a large threat of copper world happening in the Santa Ritas. I also have connections to folks in Minnesota who are fighting a nickel mine. It's being proposed by Rio Tinto. I believe it's called the Tamarack mine. And this is led by Ojibwe people, specifically the Sandy Lake Band of Mississippi Chippewa. There's also proposed projects in California, specifically the Salton Sea, which is near Indian Pass. They're proposing lithium geothermal brine extraction in these areas. And just to give you a little more background on the state of mining, hard rock mining in this country, currently here in Nevada, where I live, there are 58 proposed lithium mines. And you may or may not know, so I guess I just like ground us in this reality that lithium and other materials, things like copper, nickel, cobalt, they're all being touted as necessary for the energy transition, which is super convenient for the extractive mining industry. And so across the West more broadly, actually, there are 83 proposed lithium mines. And again, this is just lithium. This doesn't account for like the copper and the nickel and all the other mines that they're trying to rush through now. And you may or may not know also that mining, hard rock mining specifically, so we're not talking about coal mining here, it is the most toxic industry in the country. It's also the most toxic industry actually here in Nevada as well. And another thing to note is that Las Vegas is the fastest warming city in our country, and Nevada is the driest state in our country. So when 58 of 83 of these proposed lithium mines are in the West, are in here in Nevada, we have to immediately recognize, regardless of all the other facets of violence that are associated with mining extraction, that this is like on its own just makes no sense. It is, and this isn't to say that we should mine elsewhere at all. It's just to highlight that there's absolutely nothing about the mining industry that is clean. And also, like, the mining industry clearly does not care about the greater ecological crisis when they're trying to, right now in Nevada, every hour, the mining industry is pumping millions of gallons of water every hour, every day of the year. 12 years ago, the EPA reported that over 40%, so this is 12 years ago, so I'd love to know what the stat is now, but let's see, mining was responsible for over 40% of the pollution of the West's watersheds. And so it's so fascinating to fast forward to today, 2022, and we're just being like collectively kind of duped into thinking that more mining is somehow going to get us out of the multiple crises we're in, but specifically this broader ecological crisis. So this, of course, none of this is even touching on issues of sovereignty and community self-determination. There's so many layers to this. And so not only does my work include supporting impacted communities and their chosen resistance, but it also includes political education in places like Clark County, Nevada, which is extremely urban and is less touched by the mining industry. And so basically working, for example, like working on ways to address the realities that EVs, for example, electric vehicles, are really a false solution, especially in a place like Las Vegas. basically, if we're going to perpetuate car culture, that also means that we're perpetuating the more cars, which means more roads, which means more highways, which means more parking lots, which basically means more blacktop. And all of this blacktop contributes to something specifically here in Nevada called the urban heat island effect. And that is really what's contributing to how fast we are warming. And so for all of those reasons and many more, our public transportation is shit here. And so it's really convenient, again, that the automobile industry and the mining industry wants to just say more cars, but really, wouldn't it be great if we actually had efficient and expanded public transportation so people could actually get around? Like when I moved to Nevada, my car insurance went up to $200 a month. I mean, having a car is not cheap and it's not an equitable solution, but it's a convenient solution for government and industry. So that's just wanted to share with y'all a little bit of where I'm coming from and some of the work that I do and what brings me into this conversation with y'all, and how I know Peter. And so I just wanted to share that. And yeah, so there's a lot of issues that I'm working on that Peter really touches on in the book. And so with that, I will pass it to Peter. Peter, you're muted.
I'm not a cat. Okay, I'm here with y'all in the 21st century. We got this. Okay, yeah, I wanted to thank Ash for the invitation and organizing this event, and all of the folks from Firestorm Collective for keeping it going through these times. And I also definitely wanted to thank Sarah for doing this event with me. I think it's especially important for her to be here for a couple of reasons. So a really important aspect to how we confront the ecological crisis, I think, has to do with paying attention to place and forming a relationship with the land that we live on and in. And yeah, for most of the last 16 years, I haven't spent a whole lot of time in North America. So I think it's important to also favor perspectives that might have more in common with the context of where we're living. And also mining, as Sarah pointed out, is really, really important. It's one of the key areas where you can distinguish between the false solutions to the ecological crisis and real meaningful solutions. And mining and organizing against mining or on the consequences of mining isn't something that I've had as much experience with, because where I was living in Catalonia, more cogent or immediate issues had to do with adapting to the desertification, which is going to potentially wreck a huge part of the Iberian Peninsula, dealing with food autonomy and urban gardening and access to the land, dealing with the consequences of industrial agriculture as that system is failing before our eyes. Really, the only mining that was taking place near where I lived actually was mining for fertilizers. Well, actually, interestingly, industrial fertilizers and explosives, bomb making and stuff. And it's just very poetic that we live in a society in which you go through the same processes to feed people and to make bombs to kill people. So the kind of mining that was adding to some of the devastation of the land that I had been living on for the last 7 years is not related as much to getting the raw materials for batteries and for this big green transition. There is an increasing amount of lithium starting up on the other end of the Iberian Peninsula in Portugal, but that's not something that I have direct experience with. So I thought it was I'm especially grateful to have Sarah here to talk about that connection, just because mining is such a central issue. So when we were planning out kind of how to do this and what to focus on, it's kind of hard to know how to break down this topic, especially when you insist on bringing a radical view to this topic, which means making everything more complicated. I don't like to talk about climate change or the carbon crisis or whatever, because it's so much bigger than that, and they're all interconnected. And parsing that down to just climate change is one of the ways that technocrats, that states, that corporations manage to keep control of the problem and manage the problem permanently rather than actually dealing with the problem. Basically what I'm trying to say is to like talk about, you know, just everything that's in the book. We would probably need like 8 days, which we don't have. So what I'm going to do is summarize the basic arguments or topics in each of the 5 chapters of the book, and we're going to ask for y'all to pose questions of, you know, what would you like us to focus on. So yeah, like Ash mentioned, I guess yeah, comments are open, so you can pose questions there. So I'm just going to go through and in as coherent a way as I can try to summarize the arguments in the 5 chapters. But again, like it would be much nicer to be able to go into detail. I don't like doing, like, you know, book presentations that are just summaries. So this is just, you know, to give you an idea of like the things that we could be talking about, and also definitely if anyone wants to learn more about the mining related organizing that Sarah's doing, you know, please pose questions to either one of us or both of us. So chapter 1, the basic argument is that the way we are being taught to think about this crisis and to talk about this crisis is all wrong, and it sets us up for failure. It's not a future crisis or a crisis that's just begun recently, and humans are not to blame. It's often referred to as anthropogenic climate change, meaning climate change created by anthropos, by humans, and that's just not true. Talking about climate change is so reductionist that I think we can say it's even inaccurate. Rising temperatures are just one part of a huge interrelated multi-crisis. So that's chapter 1. Chapter 2, taking action on climate change is irrelevant because at this point, all the major companies and institutions responsible for the ecological crisis are taking action. The actions we are being encouraged to participate in or cheerlead for are only spreading or deferring the problem. None of them are real solutions. This includes green energy, carbon capture, new technologies, adopting carbon-free lifestyles, supporting conservationism, supporting new laws, the NGOs. Meanwhile, one of the first and principal responses to the ecological crisis by the dominant institutions involved police and death squads. And in the dominant conversation around, you know, climate change, that isn't going to make sense to most people. What is the government and the corporations doing about climate change? Death squads. The fact that that's hard to understand shows how much we've been siloed and trained to think about this and to act about this in all the wrong ways. Chapter 3 is the biggest chapter in the book, and a huge part of the book is long-form interviews with anarchist and indigenous comrades from all over the world. A few of these examples: people from Lazade who stopped a new airport in France. They won in this major battle that would have, you know, just like the growth of airports and tourism and all that is definitely a major contributor to the like carbon emissions and climate change and destruction of habitats and all the rest. Anarchists and Dayak communities fighting palm oil plantations on Borneo. Palm oil is really interesting because it's a major part of industrial food production, and it's also very useful as like a supposedly green fuel, and it's connected to genocide. Anti-capitalist networks in Venezuela feeding hundreds of thousands of people amidst the ongoing collapse of capitalism, and they're doing that through horizontal networks between folks in the mountains and folks in the cities. One really interesting one is Terra dos Povos, which is a network of liberated territories in Brazil, practicing food sovereignty and strengthening what they call the Black, Indigenous, and Popular Alliance. If you want to hear more about that. Anti-capitalists in the US helping the planting of food forests in migrant and poor neighborhoods. And then in Catalonia, where I was living, old squatters working with sheep and goats to restore native forests in the face of desertification. So if you want to hear more about any of those really amazing struggles that are going on, I can speak more about some of those. Chapter 4 deals with the question of what's the best overarching strategy on a global level to deal with this crisis. What are these concepts of an ecosystem of revolt or an ecological revolution? These are concepts that very much depart from or contradict traditional leftist notions of revolution and of struggle, an ecosystem of revolt or an ecological revolution. And why, so there's like a false pragmatism that lead a lot of people to turn to the state in desperation. So we're really desperate, time is late, the hour is going late, whatever, and people think, well, the state has a whole lot of resources, so it's pragmatic to turn to the state to try to deal with this crisis. Why is that actually not a very realistic idea? And then finally, chapter 5 deals a lot with imagining longer term solutions to this, not just resistance right now, but what would the world look like in 20 or 30 years if we start to succeed? How will our struggles change? How will we connect liberated territories? How will we spread the idea of an ecosystem of revolt? So these are all different areas that we could go into. So yeah, hopefully some questions are coming in.
And if y'all still need to stew on that a little bit, I have some questions too. So I can lead us, but I'll give it another couple seconds and see. I don't think there's any questions. Okay. Okay, well, I guess, what's a good place to start? So I think an aspect of the book that I really liked was the space that you gave to highlighting the necessity of growing our connection to the ecological worlds that we're embedded in. And I think it further indirectly highlighted the problem of treating the ecological crisis as a single issue of like carbon emissions and global warming solely, because we know obviously that everything is connected, and that's kind of what got us into this like mass catastrophe in the first place. And so you shared how you grew your connection to the more than human world by starting to track and learn about the different bird species that were in your area. And so I feel like in my brain, this is kind of like this antidote to the individual solutions to the climate crisis that is sold to us by capitalism. So things like banning plastic bags and banning straws. It's more suggestive to me of kind of like a internal revolution of sorts that's necessary for all of our collective well-being. So it's not like, you know, that saying like kill the crop in your head. It's not that. It's like, you know, like kill the colonizer in your head, kill the Descartes in your head, who have told us that we are separate from the ecological world and not a part of it, and also that we're superior. So I guess my question is, will you share more with folks the impacts of this practice on you, and specifically what you learned from engaging with the birds in such a mindful way? And then I guess if you could also share how these changes you feel show up in the world and how you interact with the rest of the world, human and more than human.
Yeah, so I mean, basically to kind of contextualize it, my little brother stole like the best bird guide for me, like the most expensive, nicest, fanciest bird guide, and it was like such a nice book that I knew if I just like, you know, put it on my shelf, I'd never use it. So I decided to start keeping a list of all of the birds I could identify like right around where I lived, which is not something I'd done before. And it was interesting to see the shift between, you know, I mean, you know, you might really like, you know, other non-human animals and, you know, like looking at them and whatnot. But if you don't take some other kind of step of interacting with them, then they're still just kind of like scenery. It's just like, you know, the birds collectively. And if you don't have good binoculars or any binoculars to identify birds, you really need to pay, like, you know, with their colors change so much in the light. So like, it doesn't really work just like, you know, looking at the picture of the bird and looking at this, you know, bird you see like 20 meters away that's like moving pretty quickly. It doesn't really work to identify it unless it's like, you know, like a magpie or something like super like, hey, here I am. So you have to like pay attention to like what they're eating, like what plants they're on, how they move, the shape of their beak, stuff like that. And all of a sudden you just start seeing them all in like a different way. And it's interesting because like my inclination would have been like, you know, well, identifying them, you know, putting them in boxes and like, you know, like looking at them in like a more objectifying way. But really it ended up being much more about like understanding their relationship to the world around them, what kind of foods they eat, that like how their family groups move, what time of year they're here. And it was just really, really interesting because I mean, in any territory of the world, it's gonna involve similar methodologies, but move in like a very, very different direction. yeah, it led to me like paying much more attention to these different beings that I was sharing sharing the land with, sharing my world with, like worrying about them in like a different, like much more specific way, noticing them even, you know, in like some cases, kind of like, you know, recognizing certain individuals. I think they also noticed the change of like how I was like looking at them. And yeah, and I just think it was like really, really important to like, you know, break out of this abstract, because when you're looking at beings around you and slowly starting to perceive like the relationships amongst them, then it's hard not to also start doing like the same with yourself and realize I do a lot of gardening, and so I, you know, often see some of these birds in my garden and realize like I'm shaping the habitat that they depend on, just like they're shaping the habitat that you know, that I'm potentially depending on, with, you know, if, you know, depending on how much importance that garden takes on in my survival. You talk with them too, which I think is really, really important. You know, probably most of us listening here have been brought up in a society that teaches us that it's like, you know, like silly, at best sentimental, to talk with non-human, like, you know, living beings. I'm also think like the category of animal is a bit stupid, so like I'm not gonna like stop there, to like talk with other beings. And I mean, honestly, on most days, like I feel like most humans are kind of a waste of time to talk with. I know that's, you know, not very generous and you know, not necessarily very true, but like I think there is a lot of value to talking, to dialoguing with like other living beings around us. And so yeah, like it really shows up differently, like when you don't just care at an abstract level, like, you know, when you're a part of a community and you're fighting for that community. And other, I guess, other ways that showed up, I had mentioned desertification, like the whole, you know, Mediterranean region is on course to like become not like a thriving kind of desert, but like a very sad, dead kind of desert over the next decades, through forest fires, through like change in rainfall patterns, because of this ecological crisis, because of industrial agricultural practices, for sure. There's also like not really forests in Europe. There's like tree plantations, and like very few people. It's like so bad that I think very few people can like recognize the difference between like a tree plantation or second generation tree plantation and like an actual forest. Not nearly enough people in North America can do that either, but I think it's even worse over there. And so there's a real need to, like, if we're, you know, going to avoid, if folks over there want to avoid like the worst kind of desertification, to recognize that humans have always been, or at least going back as far as is ecologically relevant, have been a part of the ecosystem there. And that means they've also been a part of the forests there, together with goats, sheep, and other species that were in like a symbiotic, independent relationship with humans. And for the forest to become forests again and not just like die off and become desert, we need to be participating in changes, because it's like there's like not a lot of time for that to happen. And so we need to be speeding up this shift from these like exotic pine species that were useful for the forestry industry to a lot of the native Mediterranean species that are especially drought resistant and fire resistant. And so some of us, you know, we're also adopting this practice of like planting trees and like adopting little baby trees and like trying to speed up this shift, like another generation of tree. And like, you know, like theoretically, like some big NGO or government could like plant a lot more trees in one day. Usually those tree projects, when there's not like attention and care behind it, you know, they end up dying. It ends up not being very effective. But if a lot more people do smaller scale practices, then that would have like the larger capacity of getting more trees effectively planted more quickly. Not, you know, one institution like, you know, planting 1 million trees, but like 1 million people each like taking care of like a dozen trees. And like when you do it that way, like the trees are your babies, you know, like you have like a relationship with them, you take care of them, and you're much more attentive to the community that they're growing up in and the health of that community in a way that an NGO or a government institution never could be. So I think, you know, these practices that would be like dismissed as like sentimental or silly are actually much more intelligent and much more effective.
Yeah, I appreciate you going into more detail on that. I think it was like kind of, to me, it was actually a theme throughout the book, but it was kind of more like an undercurrent. And so I wanted to make sure that we lifted that up, because I think it's really an important part of kind of like what you're pointing out in the book. And I know there's a question in the Q&A, but I have a follow-up question to this, and then maybe we can go to switch to the conversation around frontline communities. So something else that I picked up on that I feel like kind of relates to this undercurrent theme of the book is that despite the urgency of these issues, which you do admit to in the book, you know, that there's like urgency around survival, I feel like you're essentially asking readers, or at least showing readers, how you slow down. So for example, you know, what you just shared and like your time getting to know the birds and how you reflected on all of this. And so I feel like there's almost like this paradox that I found in the book from you and from some of your contributors, which was, I think, a key part of addressing something that is in fact very urgent is actually to slow down. You also say in the book that, quote, "For me, the greatest lesson is that quality is the most important sustainable thing." And so, end quote. And I feel like that also speaks to this theme. It's like this idea of being really intentional. And I think, you know, another example was one of the peasant and indigenous led movements in Brazil. They were trying to do like agroecology, and the speaker talks about how what actually first is required in that movement space and taking land back is actually feeding people and planting food to feed people. And like, as we know, as gardeners, feeding people and ourselves with our gardens requires patience and intentionality and like a slowness kind of. So I think, yeah, urgency is such a facet of white supremacy culture too. And so in reading the book, I kind of found myself being like, yeah, wait, slowing down, whether it's to learn about the birds in your community and feel more connected to your ecosystem in that way, or whether it's to grow food for your community, this is a resistance that does actually meet the urgency that's required. So I'm curious what you think of this analysis, and if you can speak more to your feeling that, yes, there is urgency to these problems for sure. Like survivability is like, it's concerning, it's alarming, obviously for some people more than others. You address in the book that there's a haste that's often used in response to these things, and it actually ultimately harms movement building and really benefits our enemies. So I just wondered if you could speak more to this idea of urgency.
Yeah. So the society that's responsible for ecocide, for the ecological crisis, Western society, or whatever you want to call it, has a certain paradigm around time, has a certain idea of this is what time is. And, you know, you don't typically, you know, your day-to-day, you question like, you know, oh, this is, you know, one philosophical view of understanding what time is. You just kind of like accept it, like, you know, I got to go to work at 12:15 or, you know, 4 a.m. or whatever. And some of like the most deeply rooted intelligent struggles against colonialism and against the ecological crisis tend to have a very different paradigm of time. The group that you mentioned is Terra dos Povos, which is a network of liberated territories throughout so-called Brazil. And there's a really interesting conversation about like the time or like schedule of resistance with some anarchist comrades in Brazil who facilitated that introduction, interview with one of the people from Terra dos Povos, because it was the pandemic. I wasn't able to, you know, go to Brazil for the book, and also like, you know, it's, you know, why do that individually when you can like rely on our global networks to share the work. By the way, all of the author proceeds from the book go to support some of the resistance movements interviewed in Brazil and in Indonesia. And so I also want to take this opportunity to like give a shout out to like all the folks around the world who like pulled together and helped to make this book possible. So this guy's talking about like what they do when they go to help like a new community take over some territory. The focus is on food, on them being able to feed themselves so that they can actually develop a deeper relationship with the land and take care of the land, and so that, you know, so that they can survive, since you know, the people participating in this network, they're fighting every day against colonialism, against police violence, against white supremacy, against poverty. so there's like this discussion of, well, first we plant. Let me see if I can actually find it quick. They name the different like plants and vegetables that are, not ones that I'm as familiar with. Like I don't have personal experience planting a lot of these things. So yeah, we need to make the first garden to produce an amount sufficient for our existence. Beans, sweet potatoes, and corn, 3 months. Cassava, 6 months. And banana, 1 year, are species that we always plant because of their ability to generate a healthy and rich diet. And from there, they talk about having a seedling nursery with native and fruit trees. So going into agroforestry. So you have like immediately like the planting of a garden. So within a few months, people are already getting food that they can support their community with in this newly liberated zone. And meanwhile, like the network has the seed banks, it has the nurseries to support all of this. They have like the experience to support this process. And then they move into agroforestry. So it's not some NGO coming in saying like, oh, we need to kick these people off the land so it can be like a, like a protected forest that like you can take like a nice aerial shot of and get, fundraising for, hey, maybe some tourists can come in and, maybe they'll stay in this, eco hotel and all that bullshit. It starts with feeding people, which breaks the sort of dichotomy of like, oh, is this land for human use or is it for nature, as though these were like opposed things. But then it immediately is going into reforestation, but as a food forest, with humans once again being a healthy part of the ecosystem there, which is how it still is in some parts of the ecosystems under the domination of the state of Brazil, and is certainly how it was before colonialism. And in that same discussion where he's talking about the schedule, he's constantly weaving in discussion of these resistance movements going back hundreds of years, like the Quilombos, which are communities of like self-liberated people, like people who fled from and fought back against the slave trade, Afro-descendant people who allied with local indigenous people. And so there's this constant looking into the future with this like transformative vision of how like 100 years from now things could be completely different, this time scale of like we need to have food 3 months from now, and this time scale of we're in dialogue with these experiences going back hundreds of years. And so it's much less like a time frame that's like in this very narrow present. There is urgency to dealing with this crisis because millions of humans are dying every year, species are going extinct every year things are going to get worse and worse. But also, like a false solution to this is really just going to set us back. It might make some kind of difference right now, but it's going to prevent us from actually healing the planet and healing our own societies on a deep level. So we need to be doing things right now, but we can't be tricked into cutting corners, because you can't cut corners when there's such a deep wound. So like, to use that metaphor, if you do that, like you're just going to get an infection. You're just gonna like, the wound story. So we need to like recognize like, like the situation that we're in, that like, yeah, this is really bad, but we also need to relax, to breathe deep, and to understand that this war has been going on for hundreds of years. In certain parts of the world, it's been going on for thousands of years, and we're going to be dealing with the consequences of this crisis for thousands of years if humans still exist. So we need to be realistic about that and change our paradigm of time so that we're weaving together all of these different scales of time rather than existing in this eternal present, which is connected to the social amnesia that capitalism thrives on.
Yeah, I love that. Thanks for expanding on that more. I think we can turn to the first question in the chat. And hi, Al, I see your not a shitpost comment too, but I'll read it aloud. So this is from Nicholas. They said, in recognizing that the frontline communities are at forefront of stopping large projects, having real solutions with nature, and tend to practice deep solidarity, should movements that are breaking out of the climate silo towards justice redistribute their capacity towards these communities through acts of solidarity, such as mutual aid and the like? What do you think, Peter?
Do you want to say anything to that? Should I jump into that?
You can jump in. I can follow up,
Okay.
depending.
Yeah, I think definitely we need to be organizing solidarity on all levels with frontline communities that are fighting back against megaprojects. But we also need to realize that this is a struggle that is relevant in every single corner of the globe. So there's no like when I was still living in Europe, there's sort of like this, like you could call it, I don't know, like a Scandinavian view, like their societies are fine and they need to, like, you know, charitably support struggles elsewhere. Charity usually makes the problem worse. And if you don't think that you're also living in the crisis, then you don't have a realistic view of the crisis. So we need to recognize that everywhere is a front line. And one of the most important things about solidarity for the struggle, or like more easy to recognize as frontline struggles, is, well, there's maybe two most important things. One, a more developed struggle maybe can do a better job of like contributing to our collective intelligence. So for example, when they like stopped an airport in Lazad, or when they stop, when like Dayak communities in Borneo stop palm oil plantations, that generates a lot of collective knowledge, of strategic intelligence that, like, you know, me doing my little garden and planting some trees, I wouldn't necessarily be able to generate. So it's good to pay attention to those kind of struggles, because they really like are sort of like, you know, leading the way, or like showing like this like outward horizon of how our struggles can be adapting, and also like the inevitable conflicts and failures that they run into will help us prepare for, we know what our problems are now, that when we're dealing with that like really small scale, a weak struggle, sometimes it's hard to imagine what kind of problems we're going to run into, you know, when we win, or when we supposedly win. Like at Lazad, for example, that's, you know, they defeated an airport, but maybe also kind of wrecked their chances of a larger, more transformative struggle. And if we're aware of that problem from the start, we can organize our struggles in a different way. And secondly, we need circular global relationships. We need relationships between struggles. A lot of folks who grow up in the global north do like revolutionary tourism, where we'll travel to other parts of the world as an individual. And like, you know, say, oh, you know, I went to this place and that was cool, but we're not thinking of ourselves as part of a larger group of people where we can be bridges between, like, you know, a struggle in the Bahia region in Brazil and, like, you know, like a housing movement in Barcelona, for example. Like, we're not going there like bringing our people with us. And like, we're not fucking individuals. Like, if you think individuals exist, like, I don't know, it's just not, that idea doesn't hold water. And it's just damaging. It leads us to, like, you know, continue supporting these weak practices where we're constantly reinventing the wheel. So I think solidarity is not important as charity, because we think, like, you know, like any other struggle like needs us and like needs our benevolent support, but because we need those relationships. They need those relationships, we need those relationships, and the best way to create them is by getting to know one another and to build actual relationships, but not as individuals, as I hate the word community, but as like pro-communities, as like communities waiting to be born.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think something that I would add too is, like, in my experience, something that often, so I guess first to say that these mining projects are often happening in pretty rural areas, at least here in Nevada, they definitely are. They're being proposed in rural areas. And so, you know, with rural areas often comes less folks who are engaged, and also sometimes, at least here in the United States, like a different kind of political alliance or allegiance, what have you. So I think recognizing first and foremost that, like, from the jump, a lot of times communities really need folks to build relationships with them so they can help lift up and work on these movements, and also in order to, like Peter said, to kind of like interlock all these front lines across the globe, really. Something that happens a lot because of the ruralness, really, in some of these places, is like a lack of capacity. So especially too, like in this day and age where folks really want to lift things up using things like social media, you know, folks have like regular day jobs too. And so thinking about like what kind of, like, not from the charity perspective, like, but what can you offer? I mean, there is, like, you know, I know here there's asks for kind of like something Peter had said earlier, was just like building kind of like a collective knowledge and understanding of what's going on. And so that's something that I think is really needed in some of these spaces. And sometimes political education is missing. And so I think kind of trying to get on the same page with folks, and so where everyone's kind of having at least a shared understanding of the issues that we're facing is really important. But yeah, I guess the one thing I would highlight in my experience is that capacity is often lacking, and sometimes that I hear people say a lot, and it's not that I don't disagree with it at all, because I know it people mean well when they say it, but it's like, you know, all of this needs to be led by frontline communities. Yes, of course, because like in Peter's book, a constant theme is that these are the folks that have the solutions, the people who are embedded in the ecosystems that are being impacted. They're the ones who have the solutions. They're the experts of their own lived experience. But with that being said, there's also a piece that sometimes that makes the rest of us who are not necessarily on the front lines of extraction kind of like almost like sitting around, and maybe we become like despondent. We're not doing anything because we don't think something's happening up at Thacker Pass, for example. And so I guess I would just say there's like this other side, which is recognizing that in building solidarity, we have to build collective power too. So you can't just kind of like show up or not show up because you think that that like nothing's going on. So I guess what I'm trying to say is kind of like you have to find your front line, and you have to kind of have like a mutual relationship and not one that is like extractive, because sometimes that happens too. So yeah, I guess it always just depends on where you're at and the locality and the issues at hand and what people are fighting for. Because some folks are framing it not, you know, a lot of times we see, especially here in the United States, it's not necessarily like we're fighting a pipeline, we're fighting a mine, we're fighting for water, we're fighting for life. And so that's another thing that we have to consider too, is like how front lines are framing the issues that they're facing, and making sure that we're showing up in that way and not necessarily acting like we know better if we're not necessarily a part of a frontline community, but we want to find ourselves in solidarity with them. Okay, so Greg is asking, for those of us who currently live in cities, would the preferred, quote, medium and longer term scenario, unquote, over the next 10, 30 years maybe, would it be that people leave the cities and, quote, go back to the land, unquote?
That's a very important question. I think so. My tablet is old and the battery is starting to go down, so it's like balancing a pumpkin now. This is kind of
oh my God, amazing.
But okay, so anyways, that's a really important question, because of course one of the effects of capitalism and colonialism around the world has been urbanization. I think we need to be skeptical of programmatic answers, dogmatic answers, and one-size-fits-all answers that are claiming to be valid around the entire planet. I've thought about this a lot in the organizing that I was doing in Catalonia, where first I was living in Barcelona, in a city of several million, and then I was living in like the countryside or on the outskirts of a small city like an hour away. And so what I'm going to be saying is entirely inflected by that experience, and I think that it will have to look differently in different parts of the world. But yeah, maybe like this way of thinking about it can like help people in different parts of the world think about it in you know, reference to their own situation and their own reality. So one like a common part of the problem is that, like, you know, cities pretty much always concentrate more people in one place than can be sustained by the land that they're immediately living on. In the history of state formation, early cities were often involved in sort of like the colonization of surrounding countryside, and that actually was like a motor of state formation, like giving more impetus to like the need to create institutions that could dominate a wider territory just for the city to be able to feed itself. However, it's really important not to fall into dogma around that, because cities can become a lot of different things. And I found it helpful to try to break through the dichotomy of city and countryside, because I think what would probably happen if our movements got stronger and if our movements increasingly became infused with anarchistic methodologies and global consciousness and all the rest is capitalism, like other complex systems, tends to face a situation where it reaches a tipping point and then collapses. So that changes for a very long time. It's like subterranean. It's like building pressure, building pressure, building pressure, and then it collapses. And right now, in most cities, like their food supplies are coming, not just from like a 200-mile or kilometer radius, but like from all over the world. They're coming into the ports and all the rest. And at a certain point, like that could simply stop, or it could become like a lot scarcer. And we've actually seen that in some of the countries that are like, potentially at the forefront of all of this, where capitalism could already be said to be in collapse, like Cuba, like Venezuela. So what are people going to do in that kind of situation? They're going to rely on their relationships. They're not going to rely on, some like abstract theory that like, okay, well, now it's time to abolish cities. And they're certainly not going to behave like they do in, various apocalyptic thriller movies that, come directly out of the imaginary of white supremacy that are, practically like, zombie movies, or like, the Road, stuff like that. So, in a place like Catalonia, a larger proportion of people have some kind of relationship with, like, maybe like an older family member, grandparent, or something like that, who comes from like a smaller town or a rural area. And then there's also like a lot of organizing that has to do with even this like back to the land stuff, even though I think that that's like a not helpful concept, that's going to lead to imperfect practices. That means that people will have some awareness of like the land outside the city. And so in moments of crisis like that, I imagine some people, staying in the city, and other people who have like a stronger connection with like more land. When you're doing agricultural work like that, there are specific moments of the year when you need more help, right? Like in the day-to-day, like, like a larger farm can be tended by like a smaller group of people, but around planting time, harvest time, stuff like that, it could be really, really helpful for you to have like a whole bunch of people come through. Capitalism tends to do that with hyper-exploited migrant labor. A more anarchic society could do that in a way in which no one is entirely a city person or a country person, but there are networks where like on your block, you have a strong relationship with like a masía, that's like what like a sort of like, large kind of farmhouse is called in Catalonia. You have like your specific, relationship with a farm somewhere. And when you need to get out of the city, that's where you can go to relax. When they need a whole, 100 people to help them, get their harvest done in 2 days, then they're calling on you. So like everyone has like 1 foot in, or most people have like 1 foot in like in an urban environment where like a lot of the infrastructure currently is, and then 1 foot in the countryside where there's land that they could actually feed themselves with. And that's another thing, like the solutions are not going to come out of manuals, out of guidebooks. They're not going to arise out of dogmas. Like it might be, ideal if, we could have a world in which the population were more evenly distributed and there weren't these cities. But guess what? We don't get our ideal apocalypse. We get like, a shitty, nasty apocalypse that's like based on the world system that caused that apocalypse, in which resources are concentrated in cities. Like it takes a lot of resources to build a house, and currently most of the houses are in the cities, and people aren't going to be able to just like build houses that are like safe enough to live in without being heated by fossil fuels in the space of a year or two. There are also huge transformations that can happen inside cities. Cities can grow like a large proportion of their food within the city if you get rid of cars, for example. And in fact, La Habana in Cuba already went through that. They already did that when the USSR fell apart and all of a sudden Cuba lost their resources to fossil fuels. They basically experienced the collapse already at a time also when the US was tightening its embargo to try to get people to like rise up and overthrow the socialist government there, with the US doing its typical thing of using hunger as a weapon. And what people actually did was they organized spontaneously and horizontally and transformed La Habana into a city, a large city that grew a huge part of its own food through these community gardens. And that it was allowed by the government, but it wasn't organized by the government because governments aren't capable of that level of collective initiative and intelligence. The government stepped back because they knew that if people like were any hungrier, then they would face potentially like an insurrectionary movement. So we've already seen that people have the capacity to turn on a dime and to transform their environments to see to their survival. So yeah, I'll stop there to not be too long-winded, but I think I think the answer is neither. I think the answer is a transformation that erodes this division between city and countryside, because the countryside is also completely industrialized, right? The countryside is not like nature. Like farms these days are factories. Whether even if they're under the open sky, they're still organized in a way that's completely ecocidal, that's dependent on chemicals and fossil fuels, and that also needs to undergo like a total transformation every bit as much as cities do.
So next, I want to kind of unpack an idea that was introduced in the book by a contributor, but then later by you. I think it was in chapter 4 under versatile strategies. And so this idea of unity as a failed strategy, I think like on the surface, people might see that and be like, wait, what? And so basically you both kind of talked about the dangers of submitting to like ideological or cultural unity, and basically point to the fact that movement history shows us that a diversity of tactics often is what means success. And there was definitely specific examples that you started to talk about earlier in France. And so with basically, yeah, they stopped the airport, but then they kind of lost their ability to kind of maintain what they had built. And so I guess I'm wondering, can you elaborate more on this idea of like unity as a failed strategy, and maybe even go more into the example in France?
Yeah, so like the idea of unity, I mean, I would argue that it's coming from a leftist imaginary that requires centralization, that requires homogenization, that requires like following the marching orders of whatever political party has like gained dominance in a movement. Of course, people could argue that it doesn't have to mean that that there are other kinds of unity that allow for diversity, but I think it still makes us expect a certain absence of conflict and an idea of like having like the same goals. And I don't think that's very helpful or realistic. Conflicts should be like the compost of our movements. Like they should be like really helpful. They should be like ways that we can learn. And we shouldn't have the expectation of starting from shared goals, right? Like what we have is like we face like a shared present. We face a shared crisis and threat to our survival and threat to the things that we love. And out of that, we can find moments in which it makes sense to walk together. We can find moments in which it makes sense to share. We're also going to find moments when it makes sense to take some distance, to go down different roads. And if we're not expecting that, then we're more likely to see that kind of difference as like a signal that like, okay, this other group is actually our enemy now, or they're not on board. And like like the world doesn't need that. Like every bioregion is going to need to organize in a different way anyways, because like we face different particularities, we come from different histories. And so I think solidarity is a much more helpful concept than unity, because it in no way leads to that expectation of sameness, but in fact it's premised on the idea of there being different places, different parts, different needs in the struggle. So I think like, okay, I mean, I tend to like, make strong criticisms of like ideas and practices that I disagree with. I also want to emphasize that I think it's really important to have like very different practices in the struggle, to have like, people out there doing things in a way that I disagree with, because like we can also learn from that, because, we are frequently not right about things, as surprising as that possibility may be. And if we can deal with those disagreements in a respectful and solidaristic way, that's super important, because that means that, we can still try to develop our methods of struggle and learn from them, but then have other methods and other experiences to fall back on when we run into like inevitable dead ends, roadblocks, and failures. It means we're going to have people who have our backs, even if we haven't been able to, convince them to like, be on the same page as us. And this is really important. it actually helps us distinguish between folks and groups and movements that, you know, are really, you know, our potential allies, and the ones that are trying to dominate movements, to turn movements into career opportunities. The greenwashers, like the eco-Leninists and crypto-authoritarians, who are, you know, trying to like control our movements, like because they're dogmatists, or because, you know, they have like massive egos that they can't question. Like if respectful solidarity is a basis, then those kind of practices will start to like be like a squeaky wheel, or like attract attention as something that's out of place. And so that means that there's like very different visions of like coalition organizing, for example, of like, you know, do we like downplay our differences and try not to talk about them and just like, you know, move together because like, you know, like more groups together like has more political weight, can bring more political weight to bear on a problem? Or do we actually want to like really acknowledge like the richness of our differences and like openly debate, you know, what are our different visions for the future and all that? And there were some comrades, because of course like there were so ZAD means like zone to defend, and there ended up being like a lot of different, like more than a dozen different ZADs throughout France and other French speaking regions of Europe, fighting macro projects, and like a number of them were able to block projects. But in the original one, that was like trying to stop a new airport in northern France, there were some groups there that were, you know, doing like a lot of politicking, like in these coalitions, building this kind of false unity, and ultimately, you know, betraying some of the more radical elements in that movement to move away from this idea of like liberated territory, where like the people who lived there and like the farmers in the region and all the rest were, you know, like the only ones who mattered to like, you know, got to like organize that on their own without like permission from the state. Moving away from that model as also something that could spread beyond its boundaries to what was seen as like a pragmatic, stable deal with the state to get permission. You know, okay, so this can remain here. The airport is officially canceled. The state is supposedly not going to try to come back in and make the airport, but they're also setting boundaries around this rebellion to make sure that it doesn't spread. And yeah, so like if there wasn't like this idea of like, you know, false unity, and like, because like unity also means that like, you know, the some of the most radical people are going to be seen as the ones endangering that unity. It's kind of like, you know, who invited these guys? And like I've spoken with a lot of people who have been there. I wasn't there personally, but maybe more and more honest debates about where this could go could have helped disarm those kind of attempts to you know, like this kind of like, you know, greasy not so sincere way of like, you know, building power in coalitions where like a lot of conflict is hidden behind like this false, like, you know, more like media friendly face of unity.
Yeah, I appreciate you elaborating on all that. Something else, let's see, is there any questions now? Okay, so something else that I wanted to chat about was, I don't think it was something that you brought up in the book, but I'm wondering if maybe you can speak to it. So basically like the workers that are working in extractive industries. And this kind of bumps up also against the fact that I think a lot of the examples in your book are kind of like fighting projects from even starting or expanding at least. And so I think I'm curious about, this is kind of like twofold. Firstly, I'm curious about like, do you see, I mean, I think I know your answer, but I'm just curious if you can expand on it more. Do you see workers of extractive industries as being another frontline, like an interlocking frontline community with those communities who are like against the extraction? And then, because we know there's a lot of context there, obviously, of like legacies of rural abandonment, and all these other things that kind of play into why an extractive industry can kind of come in and create like a mono economy for these areas. So there's like a lot to unpack there, but curious about this aspect of it, and then also the aspect of what it means to to kind of be in resistance or fight something that's already there, but you just don't, you weren't able to stop it from happening, but you still are fighting it. I'm just curious if you have any like more examples of that, if you can speak to it more in any kind of way.
Actually, I'm hoping that's something that you'll talk more about, because you have more experience with that. Like, I'm aware that there have been examples of workers in extractive industries like also like becoming part of these alliances. I also think that a lot of times when workers are organized as workers rather than like as humans who turn to this destructive job because they don't have other options, like let's organize around that scarcity rather than as their identity as workers within this industry. Like that tends to like reify the work being done and to like legitimize the work being done, and not just legitimizing them as humans with needs that they have to meet somehow. The experience that I'm coming from is a little bit harder to see those kind of alliances with, because like with say like the agricultural work, in these more rural areas, like the farmers, the people who are still able to like hang on as farmers, at this point of capitalism, tend to be kind of like factory bosses. Like they're completely industrialized. They like don't have any kind of like relationship with the land in that sense, and they manage migrant workers. So they tend to be very racist. They tend to be very reactionary. They have very, very tiny margins or a lot of debt. So that's precarity, but like, a lot of, they're working with a lot of capital. And so it seems much less likely and desirable to specifically organize with them, and much more desirable to organize with the migrant workers and help the migrant workers who are already organizing. And like over in the Spanish state, they're like almost exclusively racialized folks from different parts of Africa. Okay, that depends on specifically what food product or what crop we're talking about, but in a lot of cases that's across the board. And yeah, like I think like a lot of times, like for them, it makes more sense for them to organize as like undocumented people who are like totally screwed over, rather than like organizing as like agricultural workers, because I think it makes sense. They tend to feel less connection to those farms, because like they don't have land, they don't have farms. They're working in any industry that will hire them, because like the European border regime, like the US border regime, intentionally subjects them to extreme violence and scarcity. But so yeah, maybe you could talk about experiences with folks working in the mining sector.
Yeah, I think something that we really try to be careful about is not alienating the folks who do that work, especially because a lot of times here in Nevada, it often is Native people who are working in the mines. And that again is because of this historical context, these legacies of abandonment and genocide. They're very real, and that when extractive industry comes in and makes a lot of promises to a community that already has really not a lot, thanks to all of these like systems of oppression, it's kind of hard to say no. And that's understandable that people want to feed their families. And so kind of grounding us in that reality. But also, I guess I would add too that mining is becoming more and more industrialized. We're not mining with pickaxes anymore in the United States, even though we operate under a mining law that was written when we did. So, we're using massive like trucks bigger than you've ever seen to move earth around. And so actually what ends up happening is sometimes the folks who are working in the mines are really just like so-called experts and scientists, and they are the highest paid folks. They're not actually working in the mine, but there's people who still have to drive these trucks, and they're doing the hard labor. And so those folks are still there, but it's becoming less and less of reality because of the push towards the industrialization of the mining industry. I think it's a missed opportunity if we do not consider workers. Here in Nevada, there's been a lot of investigative reporting done specifically on Nevada gold mines and looking at the workers there and how they basically feel like the industry and the company doesn't actually care about them at all. And so that's something we have to consider too, is that the mining industry isn't just bad for the people on the front lines of extraction. it's not just bad for all of us collectively. It's not just bad for the ecosystems that we're a part of, but it's really bad for the workers. I mean, there's even just thinking about public health things. I mean, folks who are in the mines are not required, at least here in Nevada, to like shower afterwards or change their clothes, and they're going home to their families. And these are like real environmental justice issues. And so I think it's a missed opportunity if we are not engaging with workers in a way that addresses the way that they've been kind of forced into this situation. It is complicated too, though, because I think in a place like Nevada, the founding of this state is completely braided into the realities of the gold rush, and with that, obviously, genocide against Indigenous people. And so another thing to consider is that you can't really separate, you know, we have neocolonialism right now and ongoing coloniality, but we cannot, in a lot of the states that do a lot of mining, you cannot unravel mining from genocide. You just can't, like they go hand in hand. And so I think that's like another layer of an entryway for more like political education and conversations, because on one hand, you oftentimes have white workers who have this feeling of like, well, what about me too? I've been abandoned in some way, but they're also oftentimes missing the insight and the criticality of understanding coloniality and how all of this is connected. So I think it's complicated, like most things are, but I think, again, yeah, it would be a loss to not engage with these folks too, because I think at the end of the day, you know, if we're talking in like binaries of sides, like they're actually closer to our side than they are to the side of the mining industry. And so being really intentional about building bridges and trying to build relationships in that way is what I would say to that. Let's see, we have like 14 minutes left, I think, right? It is 90 minutes. So I guess, oh, Q&A, let's see. Okay, Justin, I think this is Justin from Nevada. In the context of collapse of the capitalist system, what are your thoughts on security for communities going forward?
Yeah, I think it really helps for people to already be having conversations around like what to do, how to respond in moments when things change really fast. I think fewer systems, if we're talking about like, you know, civilizational systems or whatever, collapse without resistance. They tend to be able to shift between like one governing strategy and another if folks like don't rise up and overthrow them. So, you know, fortunately that means like, you know, there's also like a lot of responsibility on us. Like I think we like definitely need to like move away from like the imaginary of like, you know, collapse as like something that just like happens like, you know, poof, like, you know, without like, you know, outside of a context of struggle, and, you know, definitely away from the imaginary of like, you know, dog eat dog, like zombie fantasies and all that. So it helps to always think about collapse in the context of struggle. And struggle also means like, you know, building a lot of things, creating a lot of things. So creating things that are actually going to be useful to supporting survival is really important. Again, that's going to look different in every territory. That's going to look different in every region. And that's another reason why people need to like be establishing stronger relationships with the land and with all the other living beings on the land where we live, like with a specific territory. That's actually something that should especially be emphasized in the US. Like people move around a lot here. And I think that's like one of like the biggest weaknesses to like, you know, radical organizing is like I think that's like a feature of it being like a settler state with like a very, very advanced economy in capitalist terms, that alienation has been pushed to such a degree that like you know, people like move from one place to another, like they're like ordering, you know, one kind of coffee or another at Starbucks or wherever the hell people go these days. Like it's like a consumer choice. And like I'm probably talking about this in an ineffective way because I don't want to like portray this as though it were some individual decision, because like most things that like, you know, we experience as individual decisions are very much like results of the way that society is organized. And so I think people, like speaking like, yeah, as like a settler, like especially settlers need to be more conscious of the ways that our relationship with a specific place has been sundered, how it's been stolen from us, and also how we've been, you know, forced or encouraged to participate in that process and to inflict that process on other people, on you know, like in indigenous peoples, on enslaved peoples and their descendants. And so that's a huge weakness, because we're going to survive or die based on our relationships, based on, you know, like the network that already exists, when, you know, like the day before when there is still food in the supermarkets to the day after when there's no longer food in the supermarkets. Like it's going to be our relationships that feed us, in the broadest sense possible. Our relationships with trees, our relationships with food cultures, our relationships with like different seeds, our relationships with like the people next door who we really don't like, but, you know, and, you know, they say stupid things, but do we not like them the way that we don't like cops? Or like, you know, do we not like them the way that, like, I don't know, we don't like broccoli that hasn't been steamed right? Like, you know, can we like hold our noses and like, you know, get on with it and survive? Or like, are they actually going to be like, you know, like trying to kill us when the shit hits the fan? So yeah, those different imaginaries of how collapse might look, or how the big transformation might look, need to be developed in every territory. If we're moving around every couple of years, we're not really going to be able to do that. If we're not having that conversation with other people living in the same territory, then we're not going to be able to do that. And I think those kind of like, we can, you know, do like the more pessimistic version, the more optimistic version, and those things will really highlight our strategic weaknesses in our organizing in the moment. Like, you know, crap, we don't know anybody who has access to like seeds, or we don't know anybody who like knows how to like, you know, help insulate a house, you know, once there's no more you know, fossil fuels, and then once there's no more electricity, like, you know, running through the power grid. Or like, you know, we might know that ideal. So I talked about Dia dos Povos, like they have like the figure of like the Black, Indigenous, and Popular Alliance. Popular, by the way, in like definitely in Spanish and Catalan, and I'm pretty sure in Portuguese as well, doesn't refer to like, you know, someone, you know, with a lot of friends, or like, you know, someone who's like, you know, gets a lot of attention. Like, you know, Taylor Swift is not popular in the sense. It means like of the lower classes. And so we might have this, it's, you know, easy to have this abstract idea of like, you know, oh, clearly, you know, the ones in the bottom of society are, you know, going to be our allies in a situation like that. Are they though? Like, do we know any of them right now? Could we invite any of them right now to a potluck? Would we go to, you know, to their social center or to their house? Like, you know, would they ever call on us, like if they needed a ride somewhere? Because if like, you know, the day that there's no longer any food in the supermarkets, we've never had a conversation with those folks, and, you know, they just like, you know, see us in whatever stereotypical way, you know, justified or unjustified, like they're probably not going to be coming to us for support, and like, you know, we might end up like not being able to support each other at all. So I think those strategic weaknesses can really come to the foreground when we imagine how it might go down.
I think too, something that's connected to that you brought up in the book is you like specifically address that if you had more space or 2 volumes of the book, that you would have showcased more like autonomous technologies that are developed directly by like residents of places. And you mentioned, which I think is important to mention in these conversations, is that like we're not lacking inventors, we are just lacking control over our own lives. And so thinking through that, but I guess before I go to the next question, I'd be curious, like, because you didn't have the opportunity necessarily or the space to share any of that, I do think this is kind of like a vein of giving people some hope of just like examples, and also just like reimagining and getting more in touch with our creativity, which often is like completely squandered by like the circumstances that we're in under capitalism. So yeah, just wondering if you have any examples of that, just in the vein of, you know, hope and creativity.
Let's see, like my focus hasn't been on like exploring like specific autonomous technologies, because like that's not necessarily my forte, and also because like I trust that that's going to be like the least, like, one of the things that's going to come easiest. Because like people are actually really smart. I know I started this off by saying people are really stupid, but that's just me, not being able to handle big feelings. People are like really smart, and like the techniques and like the technologies that are going to be useful in a different context are going to get developed pretty quickly. And if we have like a well networked world, they'll be shared pretty quickly. And the problem is, if they're developed now, then they're going to be plugged into like a capitalist system in a way that's actually not going to help us. So yeah, like knowing that I wouldn't have the space for that, I wasn't looking for interviews that would like specifically focus on different technologies. And maybe there's folks who are listening now who could like post like some links or recommendations for that.
Yeah, I think even just that response is helpful in kind of like the framing of it, and realizing that these things will come when the time comes, and just remembering and having hope in that, like how intelligent humans are. So yeah, I appreciate that. So there's another question in here. Here in the US, some people are saying that over the next 2 years, we need to be supporting the Democrats in order to avoid fascism if the Republicans win all of the branches of government. And do you have any comments about that? You do talk a little bit about electoral politics in the book. Like I'm specifically thinking of the section on Cooperation Jackson, where their strategic plan does engage in electoral politics, but on a limited scale, largely as a means to protect themselves. And so I'd add that little bit of context too for folks who haven't read the book. So what do you think about that, Peter?
Yeah. I think engaging in electoral politics is a bad idea, but I also don't think we should be purists and not work with people who are doing that work. I think we need to be aware of like ways that coalition organizing can go well and ways that it can just burn us, so that we don't get played, like being like frontline and shock troops for like the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. We've seen that happen in a lot of places recently in a way that's just like utterly destroyed entire movements. We need to be aware of that. I talked about some examples of that in the book and in some of my other writings. So I think it's really important for people to think about that strategically with acts. Like we've had so many failures, like if we can't learn from them, like what are we even doing? Like as anarchists, like our greatest resource, all of these failures we've had. So we need to like remember those, be aware of those, communicate them, and like think strategically. Okay, if we're going to work with these other groups, how are we going to make sure that we don't get burned? But we also need to recognize that like we need to have some empathy with the fact that like it's when people are in situations of absolute scarcity or danger, it's going to make sense that they engage in this in some way. And that's not like that's not like a mortal sin or whatever. And sometimes sometimes they even do it in an intelligent way. And so we shouldn't like we should assume in advance that governments do exist to harm us, and we should never trust governments. But we shouldn't assume that like everyone who's engaging in survival politics in a way that also means engaging with some part of like the formal political process is necessarily wrong. We just need to make sure that we're also there to always like have this transformative horizon and this collective memory of like the strategies of revolution and ways that can really hurt us. And as for fascism, I think we're still at a moment where the center right is much more dangerous than the far right. Obviously, fascists and Nazis kill people and they're terrible and we need to defend ourselves against them. Police kill a lot more people. Journalists create support for the deaths of a lot more people. Doctors kill a lot more people. Charities kill a lot more people. And at the moment, there's not an immediate danger of a fascist takeover in this country. And I have some writings about that. I think it's going down in some other places. That's too much to go into right now. But I think anti-fascism has historically more often been used by like the center left and the left to control and defeat revolutionary movements than it has been used to actually help revolutionary movements. Usually anti-fascism means reinforcing democracy, reinforcing the center in a way that kills revolution. So I think people need to be really, really skeptical of those kind of frameworks, because in general, how they're being deployed doesn't help us, and it makes us misunderstand the danger. Borders kill a lot more people than Nazis currently, and yes, systems are falling apart, democratic political systems are falling apart, but they're not there yet. Like January 6th was not an insurrection. It was a bunch of confused people who wanted to, like, you know, cause a lot of harm, but like they weren't organized. Like an actual fascist takeover takes much more organization than that. Like they didn't have even like support in like military brass, and like all of like the studies coming out, you know, by these like, you know, centrist or progressive media institutions that are super worried about like the fascist peril. They're like, you know, like we found like 1,000, you know, cops who are also members of like, you know, fascist organizations. That's worrisome, but like, you know, there's like, I should have looked this up first, but like more than 1 million cops and prison guards and all that in this country. So that's actually like not like, look at how it happened in Germany, look at how it happened in Italy, how it happened in Spain. It requires much more organization than there is currently. So the danger of those fascists right now are like the dozens of people that they're killing every year. That's serious, that's a problem, but that's not thousands of people or millions of people like these other institutions that are killing. And their danger is how they're being utilized by the center to continue to control and pacify us and to legitimize much more important white supremacist structures. I think our focus needs to be on white supremacy and colonialism and not on fascism, which at this moment is a tool within the democratic toolbox.
That's super insightful, Peter. I appreciate the person who asked that question to kind of get that conversation going. And it reminds me of a quote in the book that was, "As long as social movements have memory, they have access to a vast store of collective intelligence. And this intelligence favors self-defense and direct action because such methods are more effective." I feel like that's kind of like the summary of the whole book in like a very short and sweet way. But for the sake of time, we are at time, I think. I don't know, Ash, like how y'all normally handle this. If I were to ask another question, it would just be like, what else did we not get to talk about today, Peter, that you wanted to talk about? So.
Cool. I'm not sure. Do you want to give a quick response there, Peter, or?
Oh, so many things. I'd you know, love to hear more about things that are happening around the so-called US. Yeah, I came back here quite recently. So I guess I'll, you know, little by little be learning about some of these things. If anyone out there is in the Midwest, actually next week, I'm going to be talking on a panel in Ann Arbor, just outside of Detroit, with someone who participates in the campaign against Camp Grayling, which is a huge National Guard training base. And that's super important. That's a really important struggle because it shows like this intersection of struggles. It shows how we can't just talk about climate. So to expand their military base, they're going to destroy like a huge amount of forest. That's really important because like the forest needs to be protected because it's stolen indigenous land. So it's already an anti-colonial ecological struggle. It's also one that shows how not only our military is one of like the greatest destroyers of you know, of land and life on the planet, but also why, you know, why is the U.S. government you know, trying to increase its training of the National Guard right now? I think certainly like in the various like anti-racist and anti-police rebellions that have been happening over the last few years, with the biggest one in 2020, the government realized that its hands were partially tied or its capacity was limited in deploying the military against its own population in the streets. So probably some of the training that's going to be happening at Camp Grayling is going to be preparing the National Guard to be used against us when we rise up as these crises continue to intensify and crescendo. Yeah, like one final like thing to mention there, like in 2008, NATO, the largest, most important military alliance on the planet, met and they discussed, you know, so-called climate change. They discussed the ecological crisis, and their conclusion was they need to get militaries of their member states ready to deploy domestically in their own cities and in their own territory by 2020. Urban operations for the year 2020. So everyone says, you know, like, oh, governments don't understand like the climate crisis. They're not taking it seriously. They're taking it seriously by training their militaries and police forces to better be able to control and kill us. And people need to start, you know, being more conscious of that. So I'm really looking forward to sharing that event with, you know, folks who are resisting the Camp Grayling expansion.
I did drop their Twitter thing in there, Peter, too. There is one last question. I don't know if you want to say it or type it, but Nicholas, they asked if there's any collective movement history books that you recommend.
Geez, so many. One that is really, really interesting because it had a format that I was definitely inspired by, based, like, it's like a very like multi-vocal book. Like, it's a book that brings together a lot of voices and, like, you know, shares these histories. Fuck, I can't remember the name, but oh my god, oh Jesus, it's I just blanked. I had it for a second. It's what's the best way to share it? Because I'm sure it's going to come to me. It was like a movement about 20 years ago now, protecting like the headwaters of the Mississippi, or like in like outside of St. Paul and Minneapolis. And it's like this book of, like, you know, or, you know, sharing, like, you know, different perspectives in the movement. It was Indigenous folks and anarchist, like settler anarchists and others, like coming together and like fighting against like the Minnehaha Free State was like one of, so like the book has like an indigenous name of the territory being defended, and then like the name of sort of more activisty name of like the Minnehaha Free State. So if people search for like a book on the Minnehaha Free State, that's really, really interesting for like the format and like that way of dealing with movement history. And I really wish, like, out of all of these collective struggles, people afterwards would try to, like, you know, preserve those experiences in that kind of way.
Yeah, if you think of it too, you can let me know, and I can include it in a follow-up email. And yeah, with that, I think I'll let folks know that, you know, covered a lot of ground today. Thank you, Sarah and Peter, for sharing your insights. Sarah for moderating, coming with questions, moderating the questions from the audience. Thanks so much to the folks in the audience who came with really engaging questions. And Peter, thank you for putting the book together, sharing these stories. If folks haven't picked up a copy yet, I dropped a link there in the chat so you can pick it up. I believe I saw a note in the book that all the author proceeds are going to go towards, do you want to say more about that, Peter?
Yeah, a couple of the movements that were interviewed in the book, in like some indigenous and anarchist initiatives in Brazil and in Indonesia. So yeah, all of the author money from the book is going to support them.
Fantastic. Yep.
And actually,
everybody who registered. Oh, sorry. Did you want
to? Yeah, just yeah. One of the people who helped with interviews in the book is actually in prison now, and so that's like, yeah, like these are like real struggles with real consequences. So it's important to get them support.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, so folks who registered for this event, you'll get a follow-up email with a link to the recording, so you can check it out again. And yeah, thanks so much for taking the time today, y'all. I think this was a really great event, and viewers both today and the future will get a lot out of it.
Thanks so much. Thanks for putting this on.
Yeah, good to see
thanks
you.
so much, y'all.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Sarah. Thanks, Peter. Have a good day.
Take care.
You too. Take care.
Goodbye now.